Chapter 3, Part 1 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 3 The Growth of Sparta and the Fall of the Aristocracies. Part 1 Sparta and her Constitution. The Dorian settlers from the north, who took possession of the valley of the Eurotas, established themselves in a number of village communities throughout the land, and bore the name of Lacedaemonians. In the course of time a city-state grew up in their midst, and won dominion over the rest. The town was formed by the union of 5 villages, which, after their union, still continued to preserve their identity as separate units within the larger unity. The city was called Sparta, and took the dominant place in Laconia, which had been formerly held by Amclea. The other Lacedaemonian communities were called the Parisii, or dwellers round about the ruling city, and though they were free and managed their local affairs, they had no political rights in the Spartan state. Footnote. There is some evidence that in later times they were under the supervision of Spartan Harmosts, but even this evidence chiefly concerns the island of Cythera, which from a military point of view required special arrangements. Footnote. The chief burdens which fell on them were military service and the farming of the royal dominions. The Spartans were always noted for their conservative spirit. Hence we find in their constitution, which was remarkable in many ways, survivals of an old order of things which existed in the days of Homeric poetry, but has passed away in most places when trustworthy history begins. The most striking of these survivals was royalty. Sparta was nominally ruled by kings. This conservative spirit of the Spartans rendered them anxious to believe, and others willing to accept the view, that their constitution had existed from very ancient times, in just the same shape and feature which it displayed in the days of recorded history. We are, however, forced to suspect that this was not the case. There can be little doubt that the Spartan state developed up to the end of the 7th century, on the same general lines as other Greek states, though with some remarkable peculiarities. There can be little doubt that, like most other states, it passed through the stages of royalty and aristocracy, and that the final form of the constitution was the result of a struggle between the nobles and the people. The remarkable thing was, that throughout these changes, hereditary kingship survived. The machine of the Spartan constitution, as we know it when it was fully developed, had 4 parts: the kings, the council, the assembly, and the ephors. The first 3 are the original institutions, which were common, as we saw, to the whole Greek race. The ephors were a later institution, and were peculiar to Sparta. We saw that towards the end of the Homeric period the powers of the king were limited, and that this limited monarchy then died out, sometimes leaving a trace behind it, perhaps in the name of a magistracy, like the King Archon at Athens. In a few places it survived, and Sparta was one of them. But if it survived here, its powers were limited in a twofold way. It was limited not only by the other institutions of the state, but by its own dual character. For there were 2 kings at Sparta, and had been since the memory of men. It seems possible that the origin of this double kingship lay in the coalition of 2 distinct communities, each of which had its own king. One tribe dwelt about Sparta, and its kings belonged to the clan of the Aegidae. The other tribe, we may guess, was settled somewhere in southern Laconia, and its royal clan was that of the Iropontide. These two tribes must have united to form a large city-state at Sparta, and the terms of the union may have been that neither tribe should give up its king, but two kings with co-equal authority should rule over the joint community. The kingship passed from father to son in the two royal houses of the Agids and the Eurypontids, and if the Agid kings possessed a slight superiority in public estimation over their colleagues, this may have been due to the fact that the Eurypontids were the strangers who migrated to Sparta. According to a pedigree which was made out for them in later days, when the myth of the return of the Heraclidae had become current, both dynasties trace themselves back to Hercules. It seems probable that it was partly because there were two kings, the one a check upon the other, that kingship was not abolished in Sparta or reduced to a mere magistracy, but the powers of the kings were largely curtailed, and we may suppose that the limitations were introduced by degrees during that epoch in which, throughout Greece generally, monarchies were giving way to aristocratic republics. Of the religious, military, and judicial functions which belonged to them and to all other Greek kings, they lost some and retained others. They were privileged to hold certain priesthoods. They offered solemn sacrifices for the city every month to Apollo. They prepared the necessary sacrifices before warlike expeditions and battles. They were priests, though not the sole priests of the community. They were supreme commanders of the army. They had the right of making war upon whatever country they chose, and penalties were laid on any Spartan who presumed to hinder them. In the field they had unlimited right of life and death, and they had a bodyguard of 100 men. It is clear that these large powers were always limited by the double nature of the kingship, but at a later period it was defined by law that only one of the kings, to be chosen on each occasion by the people, should lead the army in time of war, and moreover they were made responsible to the community for their conduct in their campaigns. But while they enjoyed this supreme position as high priests and leaders of the host, they could hardly be considered judges any longer. The right of dealing out dooms like the Homeric Agamemnon had passed away from them. Only in 3 special cases had they still judicial or legal powers. They presided at the adoption of children. They decided who was to marry an heiress whose father had died without betrothing her, and they judged in all matters concerning public roads. There were royal domains in the territory of the Parisii, from which the kings derived their revenue. But they also had perquisites at public sacrifices. On such occasions they were, like Homeric kings, given the first seat at the banquet, were served first, and received a double portion of everything, and the hides of the slaughtered beasts. The pious sentiment with which royalty, as a hallowed institution, was regarded, is illustrated by the honors which were paid to the kings when they died. Horsemen, says Herodotus, carry round the tidings of the event through all Laconia, and in the city women go about beating a cauldron, and at this sign 2 free persons of each house, a man and a woman, must put on mourning garb, and if any fail to do this, great pains are imposed. The funeral was attended by a fixed number of the Parisii, and it was part of the stated ceremony that the dead king should be praised by the mourners as better than all who had gone before him. Public business was not resumed for 10 days after the burial. The king was succeeded by his eldest son, but a son born before his father's accession to the kingship had to give way to the eldest of those who were born after the accession. If there were no children, the succession fell to the nearest male kinsman, who was likewise the regent in the case of a minority. The Gerontes, or elders, whom we find in Homer advising the king, and also acting as judges, have developed at Sparta into a body of fixed number, forming a definite part of the constitution, called the Gerousia. This council consisted of 30 members, including the 2 kings, who belonged to it by virtue of their kingship. The other 28 must be over 60 years of age, so that the council was a body of elders in the strict sense of the word. They held their office for life, and were chosen by acclamation in the general assembly of citizens, whose choice was supposed to fall on him whose moral merits were greatest. Membership of the council was described as a prize for virtue. The council prepared matters which were to come before the assembly. It exercised, as an advising body, a great influence on political affairs, and it formed a court of justice for criminal cases. But though the councillors were elected by the people, they were not elected from the people. Nobility of birth retained at Sparta its political significance, and only men of the noble families could be chosen members of the council. And thus the council formed an oligarchical element in the Lacedaemonian constitution. Every Spartan who had passed his 30th year was a member of the Apella, or assembly of citizens, which met every month between the bridge of Babyca and the stream of Cacion. In old days, no doubt, it was summoned by the kings, but in historical times we find that this right has passed to the ephors. The assembly did not debate, but having heard the proposals of kings or ephors, signified its will by acclamation. If it seemed doubtful to which opinion the majority of the voices inclined, recourse was had to a diversion. The people elected the members of the Gerousia, the ephors, and other magistrates, determined questions of war and peace and foreign politics, and decided disputed successions to a kingly office. Thus, theoretically, the Spartan constitution was a democracy. No Spartan was excluded from the Apella of the people, and the will of the people expressed at their Apella was supreme. To the people, runs an old statute, shall belong the decision and the power. But the same statute granted to the executive authorities, the elders and magistrates, a power which restricted this apparent supremacy of the people. It allowed them to be seceders if the people make a crooked decree. It seems that the will of the people, declared by the acclamations, did not receive the force of law, unless it were then formally proclaimed before the assembly was formally dissolved. If the elders and magistrates did not approve of the decision of the majority of the assembly, they could annul the proceedings by refusing to proclaim it, seceding and dissolving the meeting, without waiting for the regular dissolution by king or euphor. The 5 euphors were the most characteristic part of the political constitution of Sparta. The origin of the office is veiled in obscurity. It was supposed to have been instituted in the first half of the 8th century. The Alexandrians seem to have a euphor list, reaching as far back as 757 B.C., but we cannot build much on this. It is perhaps of more importance that the Euphrates existed in the Laconian colony at Thera, but what most of all proves its antiquity is its close interconnection with the whole framework of the Spartan constitution. But we must distinguish between the first institution of the office and the beginning of its political importance. It is probable that, in the course of the 8th century, the kings, finding it impossible to attend to all their duties, were constrained to give up the civil jurisdiction, and that the euphors, or overseers, were appointed for this purpose. The number of the euphors would seem to be connected with the number of the 5 dems or villages whose union formed the city. and perhaps each one of the euphors was assigned originally to one of the villages. But it cannot have been till the 7th century that the euphors won their great political power. They must have won that power in a conflict between the nobility who governed in conjunction with the kings, and the people who had no share in the government. In that struggle the kings represented the cause of the nobility, while the euphors were the representatives of the people. A compromise, as the result of such a conflict, is implied in the oaths which were every month exchanged between the kings and the euphors. The king swore that he would observe the laws of the state in discharging his royal functions; the euphor that he would maintain the royal power undiminished, so long as the king was true to his oath. In this ceremony we have the record of an acute conflict between the government and the people. The democratic character of the euphorate appears from the fact that any Spartan might be elected. The mode of election, which is described by Aristotle as very childish, was practically equivalent to an election by lot. When the 5 euphors did not agree among themselves, the minority gave way. The euphors entered upon their office at the beginning of the Laconian year, which fell on the first new moon after the autumnal equinox. As chosen guardians of the rights of the people, they were called upon to watch jealously the conduct of the kings. With this object 2 euphors always accompanied the king on warlike expeditions. They had the power of indicting the king, and summoning him to appear before them. The judicial functions which the kings lost passed partly to the euphors, partly to the council. The euphors were the supreme civil court. The council, as we have seen, formed the supreme criminal court. But in the case of the Parisii, the euphors were criminal judges also. They were moreover responsible for the strict maintenance of the order and discipline of the Spartan state, and when they entered upon office, they issued a proclamation to the citizens to shave their upper lips and obey the laws. This unique constitution cannot be placed under any general head, cannot be called kingdom, oligarchy, or democracy, without misleading. None of these names is applicable to it, but it participated in all 3. A stranger who saw the kings going forth with power at the head of the host, or honoured above all at the public feast in the city, would have described Sparta as a kingdom. If one of the kings themselves had been asked to define the constitution, it is probable that he would have regretfully called it a democracy. Yet the close council, taken from a privileged class, exercising an important influence on public affairs, and deferring to an assembly which could not debate, might be alleged to prove that Sparta was an oligarchy. The secret of this complex character of the Spartan constitution lies in the fact that, while Sparta developed on the same general path as other states, and had to face the same political crisis, she overcame each crisis with less violence, and showed a more conservative spirit. When she ought to have passed from royalty to aristocracy, she diminished the power of the kings, but she preserved hereditary kingship as a part of the aristocratic government. When she ought to have advanced to democracy, she gave indeed enormous power to the representatives of the people, but she still preserved both hereditary kings and the council of her nobles. Part II. Spartan conquest of Messenia. In the growth of Sparta the first and most decisive step was the conquest of Messenia. The southern portion of the Peloponnesus is divided into 2 parts by Mount Taygetus. Of these the eastern part is again severed by Mount Parnon into 2 regions: the vale of the river Eurotas, and the rugged strip of coast between Parnon and the sea. The western country is less mountainous, more fruitful, and blessed by a milder climate, nor is it divided in the same way by a mountain chain. The hills rise irregularly, and the river Parmesus waters the central plain of the Steinclaris, where the Greek invaders are said to have fixed their abode. The natural forces of the country, was the lofty rock of Ithome, which rises to the west of the river. It is probable that under its protection a town grew up at an early period, whose name, Messenia, was afterwards transferred to the whole country. The fruitful soil of Messenia, good to plant and good to ear, as the Spartan poet sang, could not but excite the covetousness of her martial neighbors. It is impossible to determine the date of the first Messenian war with greater precision than the 8th century. Legends grew up freely as to its causes and its course. All that we know with certainty is that the Spartan king, under whose auspices it was waged, was named Theopompus; that it was decided by the capture of the great fortress Ithome, and that the eastern part of the land became Laconia. A poet writing at the beginning of the 7th century would have naturally spoken of Messenia, or Pheræ, as being in Lacedaemon. When the second war broke out towards the end of the 7th century, it was either history or legend that the previous war had lasted 20 years. Legends grew up around it, in which the chief figure was a Messenian hero, named Aristodemus. The tale was that he offered his daughter as a sacrifice to save his country, in obedience to the demand of an oracle. Her lover made a despairing effort to save her life by spreading a report that the maiden was about to become a mother, and the calumny so incensed Aristodemus that he slew her with his own hand. Afterwards, terrified by evil dreams and portents, and persuaded that his country was doomed, he killed himself upon his daughter's tomb. As the object of the Spartans was to increase the number of the lots of land for their citizens, many of the conquered Messenians were reduced to the conditions of helots, and servitude was hard though their plight might have been harder. They paid to their lords only 1/2 of the produce of the lands which they tilled, whereas in Attica, at the same period, the free tillers of the soil had to pay 5/6. The Spartan poet, Tyrtaeus, describes how the Messenians endured the insolence of their masters. As asses worn by loads intolerable, so them did stress of cruel force compel. Of all the fruits the well-tilled land affords, the moiety to bear to their proud lords. For some generations they submitted patiently, but at length, when victorious Sparta felt secure, a rebellion was organized in the northern district of Andania. The rebels were supported by their neighbors in Arcadia and Pisatis, and they are said to have found an able and ardent leader in Astraminus, sprung from an old Messenian family. The revolt was at first successful. The Spartans fared ill, and their young men experienced the disgrace of defeat. The hopes of the serfs rose, and Sparta despaired of recovering the land. But a leader and a poet arose amongst them. The lame Tyrtaeus is recorded to have inspired his countrymen with such martial vigor that the tide of fortune turned, and Sparta began to retrieve her losses and recover her reputation. Some scraps of the poems of Tyrtaeus have been preserved, and they supply the only trustworthy material we have for the history of the Messenian wars. And he won such fame by the practical success of his art, that at a later time the Athenians sought to claim him as one of their sons, and give out that Sparta, by the counsel of an oracle, had sent for him. The warriors advanced to battle singing his marches, to the sound of flutes, while his elegies, composed in the conventional epic dialect, are said to have been recited in the tents after the evening meal. But we learn from himself that his strategy was as effective as his poetry, and the Messenians were presently defeated in the battle of the Great Fosse. They then retired to the northern stronghold of Air on the river Nedon, which plays the same part in the second war that Ithome played in the first, while Astraminus takes the place of Astrademus. As to Air, indeed we possess no record on the contemporary authority of Tyrtaeus, whose extant fragments notice none of the adventures, nor even the name, of the hero Astraminus. Yet Air may well have been the place where the last stand was made, for the Spartans had raised the fortifications of Ithome, which is not mentioned in connection with the second war. At Air the defenders were near the Arcadian supporters, and within reach of Pylos, which seems not to have been yet Lacedaemonian. But Air fell. Legend says that it was beleaguered for 8 years. Astramenes was the soul of the defence, and his wonderful escapes became the argument of a stirring tale. On one occasion he was thrown, with 50 fellow countrymen, captured by the Spartans, into a deep pit. His comrades perished, and Astramenes awaited certain death. But by following the track of a fox he found a passage in the rocky wall of his prison, and appeared on the following day at Air. When the Spartans surprised that fortress, he made his escape wounded to Arcadia. He died in Rhodes. But 250 years later, on the field of Leuctra, he reappeared against the Spartans to avenge his defeat. Those Messenians who were left in the land were mostly reduced again to the condition of helots, but the maritime communities, and even a few in the interior, remained free, as Parisii, in the possession of their estates. Many escaped to Arcadia, while some of the inhabitants of the coast towns may have taken ship and sailed to other places. At this time Sparta, like most other Greek states, suffered from domestic discontent. There was a pressing land question, with which Tertius dealt in a poem named Eunomia, or Law and Order. These questions were partly solved by the conquest of the whole land of Messenia, and doubtless the foundation of the colony in Taurus, in southern Italy, was undertaken for the purpose of relieving an excessive population. The Messian War, as recorded by Tertius, shows us that the power of the privileged classes had already been undermined by a great change in the method of warfare. The fighting is done, and the victory won, by regiments of mailed foot-lancers, who march and fight together in close ranks. The secret had been discovered that such well-drilled spearsmen, hoplites as they were called, were superior to cavalry, and much about the same period in Ionia we find the infantry of Smyrna holding their own against the Lydian horsemen of Gyges. The recognition of serried bodies of foot as a useful weapon in battle can be traced in the later parts of the Iliad. But it was in Sparta first that their value was fully appreciated. There they became the main part of the military establishment. The city no longer depended chiefly on her nobles in times of war, she depended on her whole people. The progress of metalsmiths in their trade, which accompanied the general industrial advance of Greece, rendered possible the transformation in the art of war. Every well-to-do citizen could now provide himself with an outfit of armor, and go forth to battle in panoply. The metal breastplate had been introduced. Metal greaves were worn, and thigh-pieces. The round shield borne on the arm had superseded the clumsy shoulder-swing shield of the heroic period. The transformation was distinctly levelling and democratic, for it placed the noble and the ordinary citizen on an equality in the field. We shall not be wrong in connecting this military development with those aspirations of the people for a popular constitution, which resulted in the investment of the Euphrates with its great political powers. From Sparta, where it was brought to a perfection which in the days of Tertius it had not yet attained, the institution of the heavy foot-lancers spread throughout Greece, and its natural tendency everywhere was to promote the progress of democracy. It is significant that in Thessaly, where the system of hoplites was not introduced, and cavalry was always the kernel of the army, democratic ideas never made way. Chapter 3